Their B-24 was burning, but instead of landing, they aimed it straight at the target. The morning of March 2nd, 1945 began with the same routine that every long-range bomber crew at Toretta Airfield had repeated dozens of times. A thin gray light hung over the base, revealing rows of B-24 Liberators parked on hard-packed dirt, their wings coated with a film of cold moisture from the night. Ground crews were already moving between the aircraft, checking oil levels, tightening turret bolts, securing bomb fins, and wiping frost from the cockpit glass. Nothing about the atmosphere suggested that this mission would be any different from the countless others flown in the final winter of the war. Inside the ready tent, the crew of B-24 Iron Beacon sat quietly as the briefing officer outlined the day's operation. Their target was the Waldstein oil refinery near Graz, Austria, a critical site still producing refined fuel that German armored units depended on. The 15th Air Force had struck it several times in the past month, but reconnaissance photographs showed rapid repairs. The refinery remained functional, which meant it remained a priority. The men had heard this kind of briefing many times, and they all understood its implication. Even in the last months of the war, Germany still had teeth, and those teeth were protected by skilled anti-aircraft crews. Pilot First Lieutenant Daniel Reeves sat in the front row, elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on the large map pinned to the board. At 24 years old, he already carried the steady confidence of a man who had flown through flak storms and fighter attacks on more than 24 missions. He grew up on a farm in Iowa, had worked tractors before he ever touched a control yoke, and had learned early how to stay calm when machinery failed. That temperament was why the squadron trusted him with a crew and a Liberator. His job today was simple and unchanging. Keep the aircraft stable, keep it in formation, and get it to the target. Beside him, co-pilot Lieutenant Mark Dillard listened with his hands clasped in front of him. He was a year older than Reeves and carried a more reserved demeanor. He handled technical details with near-obsessive precision: fuel calculations, engine temperatures, climb rates. His role was to assist Reeves in every phase of the flight, but also to be ready to take over instantly if anything happened to the pilot. Dillard had lost two close friends earlier that winter when another Liberator failed to clear a mountain ridge after an engine fire. Since then, he had approached each mission with strict focus, checking and rechecking every number placed in front of him. A row behind them, Navigator Lieutenant Joseph Klein ran his finger down the printed coordinates, cross-checking distances and headings even as the briefing officer spoke. Klein was thin, soft-spoken, and always appeared slightly anxious, traits that came from the pressure of guiding a 10-man crew across hundreds of miles of enemy territory. His task was the spine of the mission: plot the course, correct for wind drift, and keep them from straying into heavier flak zones. Next to him sat Bombardier Sergeant Henry Lawton, the youngest member of the crew at 22. He had flown fewer missions than the others, but had already proven his accuracy. His job was vital. Once they reached the initial point, he would take control of the aircraft during the bombing run, guiding it precisely through the Norden bomb site. The success of the mission depended on his steady hands and precise alignment. Further back, radio operator Sergeant Tom Aguilar listened with the habit of a man who had learned to divide his focus. He monitored frequencies, kept track of coded messages, and maintained communication with the rest of the formation. Aguilar had served in ground communications before transferring to aircrew duty, and he understood how quickly a mission could unravel when a bomber lost contact. His job was to keep the crew connected and to listen for enemy fighter activity or emergency frequencies. The remaining men, waist gunners, tail gunner, and top turret gunner, were already familiar with their responsibilities. They checked ammunition belts, verified turret rotation, and ensured each gun sight was clean. Their task was direct: protect the aircraft from fighters and stay alert for any threat approaching from above, behind, or through the blind spots. When the briefing concluded, the group dispersed toward their aircraft. The cold air stung their faces as they stepped outside. The smell of high-octane fuel drifted across the field, carried by the occasional gust rolling down from the nearby mountains. Iron Beacon sat at the far end of the dispersal area. Its aluminum skin reflected the dim morning light, and patches from previous flak damage were visible along the fuselage. Reeves walked slowly around the aircraft, running his hand along the metal. He examined the control surfaces, checked the engine nacelles, and paused briefly beneath the right wing where fresh maintenance work had been done the night before. Everything appeared in order. He climbed into the cockpit and strapped in. One by one, the crew took their positions. Inside the flight deck, Dillard sat on the right side, opening his checklist. "Pre-start checks," he said. Reeves nodded, flipping switches along the overhead panel. The two men worked through each line calmly, calling out numbers and verifying each gauge. The engineer below signaled readiness, and Reeves reached for the starter controls. The first engine sputtered, coughed, and then spun to life. A deep vibration filled the cockpit. 3 more engines followed, each one adding to the steady roar. At 0644 hours, Iron Beacon rolled onto the runway, part of a long line of aircraft preparing for takeoff. Reeves advanced the throttles. The Liberator accelerated, heavy with fuel and bombs. The wheels left the ground slowly, the wings lifting them into a pale sky cut with thin streaks of cloud. The formation gathered into a tight box pattern over the coastline. Straight ahead lay Austria and the target that had brought them into the air once more. The crew settled into their stations, adjusting masks, checking instruments, and waiting for Klein's first course correction. Their day had begun just like every other mission, quiet, orderly, predictable. No one on board felt anything unusual. No one sensed the disaster waiting beyond the mountains. They believed they would fly to the target, drop their bombs, and return as they always had. But within hours, they would be fighting flames inside a collapsing aircraft, and every man on the crew would face a decision that none of them had ever imagined making. The Liberator crossed the Adriatic with the morning sun behind it, forming part of a wide combat box that stretched across the sky. The air was smooth, the engines held steady, and the crew had settled into their routine. Each man checked his equipment, adjusted his oxygen flow, and monitored the radios for updates from the lead ship. It was the kind of flight that lulled crews into a false sense of simplicity, long stretches of calm, followed by a single moment where everything changed. As they neared the Austrian coastline, Klein leaned forward over his maps, measuring drift and verifying the next heading. He reported the adjustment through the intercom in a clipped, concentrated tone. Reeves acknowledged the correction and eased the yoke slightly. Even minor deviations mattered here. The closer they came to the target, the more likely German radar crews were tracking them. Aguilar monitored the radio with increasing attention. The German radar stations along the coast were active that morning, and chatter from nearby squadrons had grown more urgent. Reports indicated stronger concentrations of flak around their route than expected. The formation tightened in response, a standard tactic to reduce vulnerability, but one that always carried the risk of mid-air collisions if chaos erupted. Far below, the Austrian landscape emerged from the haze. Dark forests, narrow valleys, and townships where the war had already etched scars into the roads and rooftops. Dillard studied the terrain through the side window as the aircraft held its altitude at 20,000 feet. He checked the oil temperatures again, checked the manifold pressure, and then rechecked the fuel transfer settings. His voice remained steady when he spoke, but he had noted a slight irregularity in one of the right engines. It wasn't concerning enough to report yet, but he kept his attention on the gauge. In the nose compartment, Lawton cleaned the glass of the bomb sight, making sure no condensation had formed on the optics. He wiped away the smudge left from his glove and tightened the adjustment screws. This mission required precise alignment. Intelligence briefings had emphasized the refinery's new defensive layout and camouflage netting. If the formation drifted off the approach angle, the entire bombing run could fail. As they approached the coastline, the calmness inside the aircraft began to erode. The gunners shifted in their seats and checked their turrets. The waist gunners loaded fresh belts into their .50 caliber guns, tested the action, and swept the barrels through a short arc. The top turret gunner locked his harness and scanned the sky above for fighters. The crew had been briefed that enemy interceptors were still active in the region, though fewer in number than early in the war. The first sign of danger came without sound, just a sudden burst of black smoke far off the left wing, several hundred yards ahead. It spread outward in a dark, precise pattern. Reeves saw it immediately. "Flak ahead," he called over the intercom. Another burst appeared almost instantly, higher this time, positioned deliberately to catch the formation as it approached. Klein pressed his pencil harder into the chart, whispering numbers under his breath. Aguilar heard more radio chatter, warnings from other aircraft already taking light damage. The formation tightened even further. Reeves lifted his chin slightly and kept his eyes forward. He had flown through worse flak fields before, but every run carried its own risks. Each flak battery adjusted its aim with terrifying speed, relying on rhythm and calculation rather than eyesight. Once they had the altitude and airspeed, the pattern became deadly accurate. The next burst detonated close enough that fragments rattled across the fuselage like gravel thrown at sheet metal. The aircraft jolted slightly. A few shouts crackled over the intercom, mostly surprised reactions, not damage reports. "Stay in it," Reeves said. "Keep formation spacing. Don't drift." For several seconds, the flak eased, giving the impression they had passed through the area. Then a sharp, deeper explosion echoed from the right side of the formation. A Liberator 2 boxes overtook a direct hit to its outer wing. Fire erupted instantly, and the aircraft slipped out of alignment. Reeves focused ahead, refusing to watch its descent. He had learned long ago that looking didn't help the men falling behind. Dillard checked the gauges again and leaned forward. "Engine 3's running a little hot," he said. "Not critical. Just keeping an eye on it." Reeves nodded, but didn't divert attention from the flak that was growing thicker. He steadied the aircraft as another series of bursts climbed toward them, each detonation closer than the last. Smoke trails were now rising in an organized pattern, an unmistakable sign that German gunners were tracking their altitude with precision. The next explosion broke the illusion of control. A shell burst directly beneath the wing root, shaking the entire aircraft with a violent force that knocked tools off shelves and sent loose equipment tumbling across the floor. A sudden flash lit the cockpit glass. The vibration ran through the yoke, through the floor, through every man strapped inside. The engineer shouted into the intercom, "Hit on the right side. Checking for damage. Stand by." But the problem was already visible without any report. A plume of burning fuel trailed backward from the number 3 engine, bright, volatile, and spreading fast. Reeves kept the aircraft level through instinct and training. "Mark, cut the fuel line now." Dillard reached for the emergency fuel cutoff. He tried once, then again. The valve handle resisted, stiff from heat or damage. He pushed harder until the mechanism finally moved, but the fire outside didn't diminish. Flames had already pushed past the nacelle and were licking dangerously close to the wing spar. The cockpit filled with the faint smell of smoke. Klein looked up from his charts, his face tightening. The waist gunners reported smoke entering their compartments. Aguilar called out the presence of additional flak bursts, rapidly adjusting toward them. The right side of the aircraft glowed brighter as flames intensified. The cables beneath the cockpit floor began to warm. Dillard reached for another set of controls, but the heat radiating through the metal was rapidly becoming unbearable. They were only minutes past the coastline. The target was still far ahead. The mountains stood between them and any chance of returning to Italy. The aircraft was still flying, but barely. The crew didn't know it yet, but everything that followed, every choice, every word, every second, will be shaped by the moment the flames reached the heart of the B-24's structure and began to decide their fate for them. Smoke crept into the cockpit faster than anyone expected. At first, it drifted in thin gray threads through the control pedestal gaps, but within seconds it thickened into a visible haze that blurred the instrument panel. Reeves blinked hard to keep his vision clear, his throat tightening as the smell of burning insulation spread through the flight deck. Dillard coughed once, then again, and wiped sweat from his eyes. The heat coming off the right side of the aircraft was now strong enough to radiate through the metal frame of the cockpit. He reached down to test the rudder pedal resistance and felt the unusual stiffness immediately. Something in the control cables was being affected, either tension loss or heat distortion. Neither possibility was good. The intercom erupted with overlapping voices about flames under the bomb bay doors, smoke filling the waist section, starboard side heating up, can't see out the gun window. Reeves steadied the yoke with both hands, using his elbows to brace against the shaking. The aircraft wanted to roll right, heavily, as the burning engine produced uneven thrust. He trimmed the controls, but the adjustments lagged. The wires beneath the cockpit flooring felt softer, as though the tension had been compromised. The fire was spreading faster than anyone had prepared for. Aguilar's voice came through with force calm. "Pilot, German fighters lifting off from Graz Field. Intercept heading toward our vector. If we fall out of formation." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Reeves already knew what that meant. A burning, slowing B-24 that slipped behind the formation was an easy kill. The Luftwaffe pilots didn't hesitate when they saw vulnerable prey. The first instinct was the simplest one: turn back. Drop altitude. Try to limp across the mountains and crash land somewhere in northern Italy. But Reeves didn't voice that idea because he had already calculated the numbers in his head. Even if they dumped fuel, even if they lightened the load, the fire was too deep. The wing structure was already compromised, and the valley routes over the Alps were narrow. If the flames reached the bomb bay, the aircraft wouldn't make it 10 more miles. Klein's voice broke through the tension, sharp and urgent. "We're losing altitude too quickly. If we turn back now, we won't clear the ridges. Fuel's burning off faster than it should. We're not making it home." A brief silence followed, long enough for every man to absorb what he'd just heard. Lawton, who had been staring through the smoke-filled nose toward the distant horizon, spoke next. His voice was quieter than the others, but steady. "We're still heading toward the target. If we can hold altitude for a few more minutes, we're close enough to make a run." The words hung in the air. Reeves lifted his head slightly, glancing at Dillard. The co-pilot's eyes were watering from the smoke, but he met Reeves's stare with the same understanding. They were past the point where survival was likely. The question wasn't how to save themselves. It was how to finish what they had been sent to do. Aguilar broke the silence. "Bailing out's not great either. We're too low and too unstable. Chutes might not open," one of the gunners added, "and we'll be captured the moment we hit the ground." Another moment of stillness filled the intercom, one that carried more weight than any order or briefing could prepare them for. Reeves looked back down at the instruments, though most were partially obscured by smoke. He checked their heading, checked their altitude. The aircraft was wounded, but still controllable. The burning wing hadn't separated. "Not yet. Bombardier," he said, voice hoarse from the heat. "If we hold this heading, can you guide us in?" Lawton paused only a second. "Yes, sir. If the aircraft stays steady." Dillard took a deeper breath and gripped the throttles. "Dan, if we commit to this, there's no turning away at the last second. You know that." Reeves kept his eyes forward. "I know." He keyed the intercom again. "All crew, listen carefully. We are not making it home with this fire. That's a fact. We try to turn back, we hit the mountains. We bail out, we're captured or worse. But the target is ahead, and we still have control. We finish the run while we still can." No one objected. There was no panic, no shouting, just a quiet acceptance that felt heavier than anything the aircraft carried in its bomb bay. Reeves leaned toward Dillard. "Keep her level. Do whatever you need to do to hold her steady." Dillard nodded once, jaw clenched against the heat. In the waist section, the gunners braced themselves as flames flickered along the outer skin of the aircraft. The metal beneath their boots had grown hot enough to feel through their insulated boots. One gunner pressed his back against a bulkhead and whispered to himself, though no one could hear his words. The Liberator descended another 50 feet as the fire continued to weaken the right wing's internal structure. Shrapnel holes from the earlier flak bursts glowed faintly around their edges, heated by the spreading flames. The smell of burning hydraulic fluid mixed with smoke, creating a thick, choking atmosphere. Reeves forced the aircraft back to level flight. "Navigator," he said, voice low. "How long until the initial point?" Klein's hand shook slightly as he checked a stopwatch. 6 minutes. Maybe less if we keep losing altitude. Reeves acknowledged. 6 minutes was not long. It was also more time than the damaged bomber realistically had. But it was enough. He made a final announcement over the intercom. "All crew, hold your positions. We're staying on course." No one replied with hesitation. The decision was made. The burning aircraft, barely controllable, suffocating in smoke and heat, was now committed to a straight, unwavering path toward the target ahead. And every man inside knew exactly what that meant. The fire had become a constant presence, an orange glare flickering along the right side of the aircraft that illuminated the smoke drifting through the cockpit. Every minute, the heat climbed higher. Paint on the interior panels had begun to bubble. The metal floor radiated warmth through the soles of their boots. Reeves could feel the temperature rising even through his gloves. The Liberator shuddered as a pocket of turbulence hit, but Reeves steadied it immediately. Dillard held the throttles tight, compensating for the uneven thrust as the burning number 3 engine lagged and sputtered. The airspeed indicator trembled from the unstable airflow running across the right wing. Nothing about the aircraft felt predictable anymore. Every noise carried the threat of structural failure. Ahead of them, the Austrian landscape grew clearer. Patchwork forests, scattered farmhouses, and the thin industrial haze that rose from the outskirts of grass. Their altitude was slipping, but they were still within the operational window for the bombing run. Barely. Aguilar's voice cracked through the intercom, strained but controlled. "Enemy fighters still inbound. Looks like they're trying to climb above us before committing." Reeves didn't look away from the horizon. "If they make a pass, tell the gunners to hold their fire until they're close. Conserving ammo isn't the point now. It's about hitting something if we get the chance." But deep down, he knew what the fighters would do. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots could spot a dying bomber instantly. They would keep their distance, observe the flames, and wait for the aircraft to lose control on its own. There was no need to waste ammunition. The fire was doing the work for them. In the nose compartment, Lawton positioned himself behind the bomb site, wiping soot from the glass with his sleeve. His hands shook from the heat and vibration, but he tightened his grip and forced them steady. The bomb site's frame was warm to the touch, almost hot. Smoke drifted past his face and collected in the lower part of the nose, making it difficult to see clearly. Klein, kneeling behind him with his maps, checked the remaining distance. "We're close. Not much longer," he said, though his voice carried an undertone of doubt. The altimeter was falling slowly but steadily. If they dropped too low, the flak around the refinery would rip them apart before the bomb release. One of the waist gunners, coughing hard, reported through the intercom. "Fire's spreading along the inner wing. If it hits the bay," he didn't need to finish. Every man understood that if the fire reached the bombs, the aircraft wouldn't stay intact long enough for anyone to react. Reeves spoke again, steady despite the growing urgency. "We're committed. Hold your positions. Keep eyes forward." The increasing flicker of flames along the right window drew his attention. The fire had begun to wrap around the wing's underside, creeping toward the fuselage. The heat now pressed against the cockpit like an open furnace. His breathing grew shallow behind the mask. Dillard tried the ailerons again, testing their response. The yoke resisted and then jerked unevenly. "Cables are softening more," he said. "They're not going to hold for long." Reeves nodded once, settling into the reality of the situation. "Just keep it steady until the drop." Outside, the ground rose slowly as the aircraft descended. The distant shapes of refinery towers came into view, thin metal columns surrounded by white storage tanks. Even through the haze, the target was unmistakable. The path toward it was nearly straight. They had drifted slightly, but Lawton confirmed he could correct that during the final approach. Smoke deepened inside the nose as Lawton hunched over the bomb site. The view through the optical window wavered with heat distortion. He adjusted the drift knob, then the altitude input, then checked the alignment again. He forced each movement to be precise. Even as sweat rolled down his temple and smoke made his eyes sting. Behind him, Klein watched the instrument panel shaking with vibration. "We're still good," he said quietly, mostly to reassure himself. "We're still on course." The flak around the refinery opened up as soon as the formation drew within range. Explosions blossomed ahead. Dark, sharp bursts timed by German gunners who knew exactly how to fire on approaching bombers. But Iron Beacon was not approaching in formation. It was alone, low, burning, and staggering in controlled flight. This made it harder for the gunners to predict. Their shells exploded in scattered patterns, some too high, others too far behind. But every new burst brought a fresh risk of shrapnel tearing into the weakened wing. Dillard braced himself as another explosion shook the aircraft. The overhead panel rattled. A few knobs vibrated loose. He grabbed them instinctively and shoved them back into place. The aircraft dipped its right side from the shockwave, and Reeves fought it back to level despite the sluggish controls. "We're close," Lawton said, his voice cracked and hoarse. I could see the whole layout. Tanks cracking towers, everything. Reeves squinted forward through the smoke. The target grew clearer by the second. Flames reflected in the cockpit glass made it harder to distinguish details, but the orientation looked right. The aircraft had drifted a few degrees off course, but not enough to jeopardize the drop. Every man on board understood that the bomber was seconds, maybe minutes, from losing structural integrity entirely. The right wing flexed in small, unnatural movements as the internal metal softened. One more direct hit might shear it off, but they still held their course. Reeves locked his elbows and kept the plane steady. Each second felt heavier than the last. He knew the controls could fail without warning. The aircraft could roll, twist, or break apart. But as long as he held the yoke, even if only for a few seconds more, they could make the bombing run count. Smoke thickened to the point where details in the cockpit blurred. Dillard wiped his eyes again, blinking through the burning sensation. "Dan," he said, voice strained, "if the cables go." Reeves answered without hesitation. "Then we drop while we still have control." Not before. Lawton tightened his grip on the bomb sight. The refinery now filled the optical field. Structures precise, coordinates confirmed. "Standing by," he said, when nearly aligned. The aircraft, engulfed in fire and shaking under the stress, pushed on toward the refinery with the last strength it had left. And every man inside knew there was no turning back. The refinery filled the forward view now, its towers and storage tanks rising through the drifting haze like a cluster of rigid metal shapes. The smoke inside the cockpit made the landscape appear distorted and wavering, but Lawton could still track the approach through the bomb sight. He leaned closer, forcing each breath through the oxygen mask while wiping the lens with the back of his glove. The glass was warm. Everything inside the nose compartment was warm now. Reeves kept the bomber level, hands locked around the yoke as the aircraft resisted him with every small correction. The right wing dipped again, not sharply this time, but with a slow, drooping motion that made his stomach tighten. The structural beams inside that wing were weakening quickly. He could feel it through the controls, an unnatural softness, like pushing against a surface that was starting to give way. Dillard held the throttles with both hands. He was sweating heavily despite the freezing air outside. The heat inside the cockpit felt uneven, hot on the right side, cooler on the left, making his body instinctively lean away from the flames, even while he stayed fully locked into position. He monitored the airspeed indicator, which trembled violently at certain ranges. The turbulence created by the burning engine caused unpredictable pressure shifts. Flak bursts erupted around them again. Closer now, sharper, and more concentrated. German gunners had finally adjusted their aim. One explosion shook the aircraft so hard that the lower hatch in the waste compartment slammed against its frame. A cloud of dust and insulation particles rained down from the ceiling. Aguilar's voice broke through the static. "We're taking hits across the fuselage. Minor so far, no penetrations through the oxygen lines yet." They yet lingered, unspoken but understood. One of the gunners coughed violently and reported fires moving inboard on the wing. "It's heading toward the center section. We're feeling heat through the floor now." Reeves didn't respond. His eyes were fixed forward, jaw clenched, focus absolute. He felt every shake of the aircraft, every vibration, every unnatural movement of the yoke. He could sense how close the bomber was to losing control entirely. "Bombardier," he said, voice steady despite everything. "Tell me what you need." Lawton didn't look away from the sight. "Just keep it straight. Just like this." A few more seconds. Klein, kneeling behind him, held a hand against the nearby bulkhead to steady himself. The metal under his palm felt hotter than before. Sweat soaked through his collar. He could hear the low groan of the wing beams protesting under the stress. Dillard scanned the gauges again. Oil pressure dropping on 3, temps rising. "She's not going to hold." Reeves answered immediately. "Doesn't matter. Just stay with it." The Liberator pushed forward, descending slightly as the fire continued to eat through the wing's internal structure. Flames now licked around the engine nacelle and were beginning to wrap up over the top of the wing. Small fragments of burning metal broke away and tumbled through the slipstream. Inside the cockpit, visibility worsened. Smoke curled along the ceiling in dark coils, drifting down toward the crew's masks. Reeves wiped his forehead with the back of his glove and kept both hands on the yoke. Lawton exhaled once, slow and controlled. He aligned the crosshairs with the refinery's cracking towers. "Stand by," he said. "Stand by." Flak exploded again, violently enough that the entire aircraft lurched. Reeves countered the roll instantly, fighting the yoke with everything he had. Dillard added power to the remaining engines to keep the aircraft's nose from dipping too far. The burning wing flexed under the new forces. Klein held his breath. Lawton steadied the bomb sight again, ignoring the tremors running through the nose. "Almost. Keep it steady, steady." Another explosion erupted close beneath them. The shock wave pushed the nose upward slightly. Dillard corrected, but the controls responded slowly. Lawton froze his hands against the bomb sight's grip. The target slid into perfect alignment. His voice, when it came, was still clear. "Bombs away." A heavy thud shook the aircraft as the bomb racks released their load. The sudden shift in weight made the bomber rise slightly, but Dillard compensated with the throttles. The bombs disappeared into the smoke below, falling toward the refinery in a neat, controlled sequence. Reeves didn't look down. He didn't need to. He could feel the subtle lift created by the weight drop. Lawton leaned forward, watching through the sight until the bombs vanished from view entirely. He couldn't see the impact through the haze, but a bright, sharp flash illuminated the underside of the smoke a few seconds later, followed by several secondary bursts. The refinery had been hit, but the moment of success was swallowed instantly by the worsening condition of the aircraft. The sudden release of weight caused the weakened wing to flex in a dangerous, jerking motion. The flames surged higher, fanned by the changed airflow. The spar, already glowing with heat, emitted a cracking sound that everyone on board heard, even over the engines and intercom static. Reeves's eyes widened slightly, not in panic, but in confirmation. The wing wouldn't hold for long. Dillard's voice came through low and ragged. "Dan, the cables are failing. Ailerons aren't responding." She started to pull hard. Reeves gripped the yoke with both hands and forced it back to level, but the aircraft answered sluggishly, like a machine fighting against its own destruction. Another crack cut through the air, louder this time. The right wingtip dipped sharply. The bomber was beginning to lose structural integrity. Reeves kept the nose straight for as long as he could. Every muscle in his arms tightened. The cockpit's right side glowed bright orange from the fire outside. Parts of the panel were beginning to warp. "We did it," Lawton said quietly, almost to himself, still staring through the sight. Target hit, but the aircraft was dying. Reeves held the yoke in place, refusing to let the bomber roll fully. He knew the moment he couldn't counter the imbalance, the aircraft would tilt, then twist, then fall. "Hold on," he said to the crew. "Hold on." The right wing sagged again. Another internal beam snapped, and the aircraft finally began to lose the fight. The first sharp roll came suddenly, a deep tilt to the right that pulled the aircraft off its line and forced Reeves to wrench the yoke back with both hands. The muscles in his arms burned as he fought the motion. The bomber resisted him, then sluggishly returned to level before dipping again. The burning wing was no longer providing reliable lift. Every second the flames weakened its structure, and every second the aircraft responded with slower, heavier movements. Dillard watched the control surfaces through the cockpit side window. The aileron on the right wing fluttered weakly, barely responding to input. He could see pieces of scorched fabric and metal peeling away in the slipstream. "We're losing it," he said, voice strained. "The controls aren't connecting anymore." Flak continued to burst below and behind them, though the German gunners had shifted their attention to the remaining formation. Iron Beacon was clearly going down, and the defense crews no longer wasted shells on a bomber that gravity and fire were already claiming. Smoke thickened inside the cockpit, rising in waves that clung to the ceiling and rolled downward with each turbulent shake. Reeves could barely make out the altimeter through the haze. The needle drifted steadily downward. They were losing altitude faster than he could correct. In the waist compartment, the gunners staggered as the aircraft rolled again. One slammed against the bulkhead and grabbed hold of an exposed beam to keep from falling. The heat from the floor was nearly too much to stand on. Metal under their boots had grown hot enough to soften rubber. Smoke seeped through the seams in the fuselage, making it hard to breathe even with oxygen masks. Aguilar gripped the radio table with both hands as another violent jolt shook the aircraft. Static hissed across the headset, but no new messages came through. He looked at the red glow reflecting across the interior wall and understood what it meant. The fire had reached deeper into the wing, closer to the central junction where the structural beams connected to the fuselage. Klein steadied himself against the nose bulkhead, staring at the instruments that now trembled beyond readability. "Altitude dropping rapidly," he reported. "We're at 6,059.58. Lawton pressed himself away from the bomb site and wiped sweat and soot from his face. He could still feel the aftershock of the bomb release, still hear the distant rumble of the refinery detonating below. They had done what they came for, but the silence in his voice revealed something heavier: acceptance of what was coming. Reeves tightened his grip again as the right wing dipped sharply a third time. This time, the aircraft didn't fully return to level. The roll slowed, then paused, then deepened further. The yoke felt slack in his hands, as if the cables were melting into non-existence beneath the floor. "Dan, she's giving out," Dillard said, watching the wing sag under its own weight. "We're losing structural support. The spar can't take the heat." Reeves tried again to correct the roll. The yoke moved, but the airplane didn't. It responded with only a sluggish tremor. Another sound, louder this time, sharp and final, cut through the cockpit. A long, metallic crack from inside the wing. Every man on board heard it. They didn't need to see what had happened. The spar was failing. Dillard braced a hand against the sidewall. That was the inner beam. Flames surged higher along the wing's surface, bending with the airflow. Sections of the nacelle tore away, leaving a jagged outline glowing with heat. The entire aircraft began to slide into a controlled but unstoppable right bank descent. Reeves held the yoke to the left until his gloves dug into the material. His arms trembled with the effort. The bomber resisted him only briefly before continuing its downward arc. Klein's voice shook as he called out altitude again. 5,048.46. The Liberator dropped through the haze, tilting more sharply with each 100 feet lost. The burning wingtip left a long, arcing trail of flame in the sky. In the tail section, the gunner sat with his back against the armor plate, gripping the handle of his turret, even though he could no longer see anything through the smoke outside. He closed his eyes for a moment, steadied his breathing, and waited. Inside the cockpit, Reeves fought the controls until the end. Every correction became weaker than the last. The yoke no longer drove the aircraft, it only delayed the inevitable by seconds. Dillard leaned forward, shoulder pressed against the console, trying to assist with the remaining control input. His voice lowered, barely audible. "She's going, Dan." Reeves kept his attention on the horizon, even as it tilted farther and farther out of level. "Hold with me," he said. The aircraft rolled past 30 degrees, then 40, then 50. The right wing dipped downward, fire trailing behind it in a long arc. The bomb bay doors rattled violently as air rushed through the collapsing structure. Reeves pushed the yoke forward, attempting to stabilize the nose, but the bomber no longer responded at all. The controls felt like dead weight. The last internal beam gave way with a final, wrenching crack. The wings shifted downward, separated at the root by heat and stress, and the aircraft snapped into a steep descending spiral. Everything inside lurched violently. Loose equipment launched across the cockpit. The world outside spun in a blur of smoke, ground, and fire. Reeves maintained his grip on the yoke until the moment the cockpit glass filled with the blur of rising terrain. He didn't let go. The bomber struck the hillside in a massive, consuming impact, the blast visible from miles away. There were no survivors. The explosion that followed the impact sent a column of smoke rising above the tree line, spreading in a slow, dark swell across the foothills north of Grass. Local farmers and refinery workers who witnessed the fall described seeing a ball of fire trailing behind a descending aircraft, its path curved with deliberate control, even in its final moments. None of them saw parachutes. None of them heard distress flares. It was clear the aircraft had not attempted to save itself. Within minutes, the German flak crews near the refinery reported that the burning bomber had released its bombs precisely over the center of the complex. Their logs recorded that the first detonations triggered a string of secondary explosions, knocking out 2 storage tanks and damaging the cracking tower. The ground shook beneath their stations, and smoke from the refinery mixed with the smoke rising from the hillside. The crash site burned for hours. Flames crawled across the scattered wreckage, feeding on fuel, oil, and fragments of heated metal. The scent of burning aviation fuel drifted down through the valleys. German soldiers who were sent to investigate found what little remained of the aircraft spread across several hundred yards of forest. The bodies of the crew were scattered and burned beyond recognition, but their positions told a story. None had reached the exits. None had attempted to bail out when the wing finally gave way. The impact crater was shallow but wide, marked by shattered tree trunks and torn earth. Among the wreckage lay pieces of the wings, blades from the broken propellers, and warped sections of the bomb bay framework. One soldier found a portion of a flight boot near the forward section. Another collected a dog tag chain fused into a lump of metal. The name stamping was warped by heat, incomplete, but legible enough to confirm the crew's identity after the war. In the following days, the crash drew quiet conversations among civilians who lived nearby. Some claimed the bomber appeared to turn deliberately toward the refinery, even while burning. Others said it seemed to glide rather than fall, as though held momentarily by an unseen force before the wing finally collapsed. These were impressions, not official records, but they repeated often enough to become part of local memory. Weeks later, after Allied forces pushed deeper into Austria, American investigators reached the area. They walked the perimeter of the crash site, now cold and silent, and documented the debris field. The technical officers made notes about the angle of descent, the fire damage, the structure of the remaining wing spars. Their report concluded that the bomber had remained under control until the final seconds, despite catastrophic damage from flak and fire. The intelligence team compared these findings to mission logs from that day. They confirmed that the refinery had suffered heavy damage at nearly the same time the aircraft disappeared from formation. Reconnaissance photos taken days later showed blackened ground around the facility's central tanks, with repair crews already attempting to restore operations. The strike had been effective, far more than expected from a single bomber. Back at Toretta Airfield, the absence of Iron Beacon was noted during debriefings. The remaining crews learned only that the aircraft had fallen behind after a flak hit near the coastline and had not returned. The official status listed the crew as missing. It would later be updated to killed in action after the investigation findings were compiled. For weeks after the mission, members of other crews spoke quietly about what they had seen. A burning aircraft descending alone, still aligned with the target even when it should have been falling apart. Some believe the crew stayed with the aircraft because they couldn't escape. Others believe they stayed because they knew they couldn't make it back and chose to complete the mission instead. There was no way to know the exact thoughts exchanged in those final moments, but the evidence pointed to a deliberate decision to stay on the bombing run. After the war ended, small memorials appeared in the hills near the crash site. Local villagers placed simple wooden crosses in the ground, later joined by a plaque installed by American personnel during the occupation years. It carried only a brief inscription dedicated to the fallen crew, men whose names were recorded officially, but whose final actions lived on mostly through the recollections of those who witnessed the burning bomber steer with purpose. In the decades that followed, the story of the crew faded from public awareness, overshadowed by larger battles and more famous missions. But in the archives of the 15th Air Force and in the memories of the families who received the telegrams, the fate of Iron Beacon remained a clear example of a choice made under impossible circumstances. The crew had been trained for survival, communication, and precision. Yet when confronted with a situation that offered no real chance to save themselves, they completed the task they had been given. The hillside north of Graz eventually returned to quiet. New trees grew where the bomber had struck, and grass covered the scars in the earth. But beneath the surface, fragments of metal still rested in the soil, small reminders of the last moments of a crew that held their course until the aircraft could no longer fly. Their story endured not because of the explosion nor the damage they inflicted, but because of the final minutes when smoke filled the cockpit, when heat burned through metal, and when the men understood the truth of their situation and chose to remain at their posts. Their decision, made in a burning aircraft descending toward enemy territory, reflected the harsh reality faced by countless aircrews in the final months of the war. They had finished their mission when survival was no longer possible. And that act alone ensured that their final minutes would be remembered long after the last pieces of wreckage disappeared beneath the earth.